We were not scoring on the other end, but at least they weren't either. And I think, it just shows like JJ, she helped us a ton defensively, and credit to her. I thought.
The Indiana Fever just played a game that almost felt like a microcosm of their entire season. Flashes of promise, flashes of resilience, and yet the ultimate collapse when it mattered most. And what makes this particular loss sting even more is that it came against a team that many would argue is at the very bottom of the WNBA standings. The type of team you simply have to beat if you want to prove that you're moving in the right direction, especially in a stretch where you're missing Caitlin Clark, the player who has single-handedly shifted the identity of this franchise, the one who pulls defenses apart with her gravity, her shooting, her vision, and her sheer presence on the floor. So when you go into this game without her, you would think the rest of the team, particularly the veterans, would step up and shoulder the burden. And to be fair, there were moments where it looked like they might do exactly that. Coming back from down 15 points, going on a 16-0 run that turned the energy in the arena and made you believe that maybe this was the game that could be salvaged, that at the very least this was the kind of gritty, hard-fought win that could define their ability to survive until Clark returns. But instead the Fever folded in the most frustrating way, letting every chance slip through their fingers. And if we're being honest, this was probably the best performance you're going to get out of this roster in this particular stretch, without Clark. And the fact that they still lost raises questions about how they're going to manage the next 3 to 6 games without her. Because if this is their ceiling, then it might be a brutal stretch ahead. The strange thing about this game was how many breaks actually went Indiana's way. You saw key players from the other side go down, Sydney Colson limping off, Sophie Cunningham sidelined, and for a moment you thought, okay, the door is wide open. The Fever can just walk through it and secure the victory. But somehow, even with all those advantages, they didn't. Instead, we saw the same familiar breakdowns, the same familiar frustrations, and in the end it leaves you scratching your head. The shot Dana Bonner took down the stretch was baffling, a decision that made no sense in context. But even then, you hesitate to put the loss entirely on her because, truthfully, Indiana doesn't even make it to that moment without her contributions, without those clutch, almost desperate shots that kept them in it. So while her late-game decision was questionable, the bigger issue lies elsewhere, and unfortunately, once again, you have to look straight at Kelsey Mitchell. The reality is this. Mitchell has been one of the most talented guards in the WNBA for years. She's an elite-level shot maker when she's locked in. She's been efficient and explosive in the past, and when paired with Caitlin Clark earlier this season, they looked like they could be the best backcourt duo in the league. The balance of Mitchell's mid-range creation and Clark's long-range gravity gave opponents nightmares. But now, without Clark on the floor, it feels like Mitchell has shrunk, instead of expanded, regressed instead of elevating her game, and the contrast is glaring. She went 4 for 15 in this one, continuing a brutal stretch of inefficient shooting, and the truth is you expect so much more from her in this situation because she's supposed to be the X factor, the player who can carry the offensive load when Clark isn't available, but she hasn't been that at all. In fact, she's been a liability, and that's why it's fair to say this loss falls mostly on her shoulders. This isn't just about one-off night either. Mitchell has been laughably bad by her own standards over the last 4 or 5 games, and when you're in a league where margins are razor-thin, where one hot shooting night can tilt the outcome, her cold spell is killing the Fever, and you start to wonder if she's dealing with something deeper, whether it's confidence, conditioning, or simply the weight of expectations. What makes this doubly frustrating is that you could see glimpses of what the Fever could be if they executed properly. Early in the game, Mitchell did feed Aaliyah Boston off a pick and roll, the kind of action you'd expect to see more often, and while the pass wasn't perfect, Boston's hands are so elite that she still corralled it and finished with her soft touch, reminding everyone that if you feed her consistently, good things happen, and that bore out in the numbers. She went 8 for 10 from the field, finishing with 17 points despite only taking 10 shots, which is criminally low considering how unstoppable she looked whenever she got a clean look. But the problem, of course, was that once the Sun adjusted, sending doubles and even triples at Boston in the post, everything bogged down, because without Clark pulling defenders away with her gravity, Boston was left on an island surrounded by collapsing defenses, and Indiana simply didn't have the shooters or the secondary playmakers to punish that strategy. This is the heart of the Fever's offensive struggles. With Clark, the floor is spaced, rotations are stressed, and Boston thrives. But without her, the defense can load up, and suddenly every possession feels like a grind. On top of that, the defense on the other end was shaky, particularly the zone, which got shredded repeatedly as the Fever failed to rotate properly, leaving shooters wide open on the perimeter. One glaring example was Sophie Cunningham getting stranded in no man's land, stuck between two shooters with no help rotating over, leading to an easy open three. That's the kind of systemic breakdown that tells you the team either doesn't understand their assignments in zone or isn't communicating well enough. And either way, you can't survive at this level giving up that many open looks. In fact, the Fever gave up 10 threes in this game, and while you could chalk some of it up to hot shooting, a lot of it was simply poor execution and slow rotations. Then you add in the frustration of the officiating, particularly with Aaliyah Boston, who seems to be refereed by a completely different standard than everyone else. She finally starts playing with the physicality fans and coaches have been begging for, and what happens? She gets whistled for soft, ticky-tack fouls that would never be called in the post against anyone else, and meanwhile you watch Clark get hammered game after game with no whistles. This inconsistency doesn't just frustrate fans, it actively discourages Boston from playing with the kind of dominance her size and skill should allow. That defied logic, deep contested threes off the dribble, pull-ups in transition without even gathering, step-backs with defenders draped all over her. And once she got going, there was simply no answer. It felt like every time Indiana clawed back, Mabry just hit another dagger to push the lead again, and that kind of heater is devastating for a team already missing its star. Even with all that, though, Indiana still had chances, they still fought, they still looked like they might steal it, but every time they needed a steady hand, every time they needed a bucket, Mitchell either bricked a shot she normally makes or disappeared from the action entirely, and that's why the frustration circles back to her. This is the player you expect to elevate, the veteran you expect to lead, the scorer you expect to carry some of Clark's load, and instead she's regressing to the point where you start to question whether she's even a reliable second option. The Fever have one of the most dominant young bigs in the game in Boston, but as we saw, she can't do it alone. She needs guards to draw attention, to set her up, to make defenses pay, and right now Mitchell isn't delivering, which leaves the entire team stuck in neutral. Without Clark, Indiana looks like a team without an identity, without a reliable offensive engine, and while Bonner provided sparks and Boston gave steady production, the lack of perimeter scoring and the defensive lapses were too much to overcome. The sad truth is, this was probably the game they had to win, the one where everything lined up for them. Injuries to the opponent, a massive comeback, Boston dominating, and they still let it slip, which doesn't bode well for the next handful of games Clark will miss. Yes, they'll get another chance against Chicago, a team some consider the weakest in the league, but if they can't beat this opponent in this situation, how confident can you really be? The Fever are learning the hard way that life without Clark is bleak, and unless Mitchell snaps out of her funk and starts playing like the star she's capable of being, these losses are going to keep piling up, and the narrative will keep shifting from promising young team on the rise to disappointment wasting another season. And that's the
down the stretch that ultimately helped your team pull out the win.
We got a lot of stops. Obviously, they were scoring the ball in the fourth quarter, but I do think when the game was.
The Indiana Fever's recent stretch of games has been nothing short of frustrating for fans, players, and anyone who believed the preseason hype around the squad. On paper, the Fever looked like a young team on the rise, built around Caitlin Clark's generational talent and Aaliyah Boston's dominance in the paint. Optimism filled the air, with analysts, fans, and even national media outlets starting to whisper that Indiana could be a dark horse contender in the WNBA. But reality, as it often does in professional sports, has hit hard. The absence of Caitlin Clark has exposed just how fragile this team really is. Without their rookie superstar orchestrating the offense, spreading the floor, and drawing defensive attention, Indiana has looked like one of the worst teams in the league. And that is not hyperbole. A team that went toe-to-toe with the New York Liberty, one of the WNBA's elite squads, suddenly looks lost against a struggling opponent like the Chicago Sky. If they don't figure things out soon, the Fever could find themselves spiraling into an early hole that even Clark may not be able to dig them out of when she returns. Take, for example, the game against the Connecticut Sun. This was supposed to be a chance for Indiana to prove that they could stay afloat without Caitlin Clark, a chance for Aaliyah Boston to reassert herself as a dominant inside presence. Early in the fourth quarter, the Fever tried exactly that, feeding Boston in the low post, looking to establish her as the focal point of the offense. But what happened next highlighted just how limited their offensive options are without Clark. Boston received the entry pass, but immediately, the Sun sent a wave of help defenders. The paint was clogged, passing lanes were cut off, and she had nowhere to go. Boston was forced into a turnover, and the possession crumbled. You can't even blame Boston for the mistake. She's an elite post player, but when defenses know they don't have to respect Indiana's perimeter threats, she's going to be suffocated down low. This is what happens when your spacing is gone, and the gravity of Caitlin Clark's shooting is missing. Boston is left battling 2 or 3 defenders at a time, and no matter how skilled she is, that's not a winnable situation night after night. Meanwhile, Indiana's defense hasn't been abysmal. In fact, you can see the effort. Players like Lexi Hull, who had a strong game, were locked in on the defensive end, contesting shots and staying engaged. But the problem is simple. The Fever are not built to trade baskets right now. On one possession, Bria Hartley worked against Hull and drilled a tough 3. That's the kind of shot you live with defensively, but without the offensive firepower to answer, those moments become daggers. The Fever have shown fight, they've shown grit, but when it comes to scoring consistently, they look like a shell of themselves without Caitlin Clark's playmaking. This is where the narrative around the Fever starts to shift. In the offseason, many bought into the idea that Indiana was building a super team, with Clark entering the league to pair with an all-star like Aaliyah Boston, alongside capable veterans and role players. But this isn't a super team. This is a young roster with talent, yes, but with glaring weaknesses that Clark has been masking with her brilliance. Without her, everything unravels. And that's not even a knock on Boston or Kelsey Mitchell, it's just reality. Clark is the engine that makes this entire team function. Her deep shooting range, her ability to collapse defenses off the pick and roll, and her court vision to find backdoor cutters like Mitchell, Hull, or Sophie Cunningham. Those are things you cannot replicate. The Fever without Clark are like a car without an engine. The frame is there, but it doesn't move.